Hello everyone, and welcome to the world-renowned review of AMC's The Terror, Episode 4, entitled Punished as a Boy. I am the world-renowned historian. One quick thing before we get going. I just want to thank everyone that watched Episode 1 of these reviews. Super cool of you. In fact, it was my most successful video to date. You know, it was the first one where I was sure it wasn't just like my family and friends watching. So, everyone that watched, awesome. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, I said in the first review that I was going to keep these mostly spoiler-free, and that was a lot easier when I was reviewing 3 episodes in one review, because it was very much just sort of overall impressions and general thoughts. Oddly enough, one thing I was careful not to spoil, the overall fate of the expedition, they give away in the first title card. So, yeah, the expedition was lost. If you started the show, you know the expedition was lost. But from now on, these reviews are going to go to much more of a recap and review style, and will be much more spoilerific. So if you haven't watched episode 4 yet, or in the subsequent ones, if you haven't watched the episode we're talking about yet, don't watch the review first. So, needless to say, from here on out,
the sparkling drinks are just...
Well, this show just keeps getting better, everybody. Like, we're approaching the rarefied era of greatness occupied by very few, like Deadwood, Game of Thrones, Rome, Twilight Zone, Breaking Bad. That's pretty much it. This is probably my favorite episode of the series so far, with characteristic gorgeous visuals, every scene packed with meaning, wonderful acting, and unbelievably clever, occasionally beautiful dialogue. The setting of the Arctic lends itself well to a supernatural story, as natural phenomena like the Aurora Borealis give the scene this sort of like dreamy, surreal quality. Episode 4 opens with what I would describe as the Lady Jane Franklin versus the Admiralty. Now this is in 1847, 2 years after the expedition set out. Sophia Craycroft and the Lady Jane are in the waiting room outside, like sort of the Admiralty's Oval Office, if you will. And we get this great exchange where Sophia asks why don't they have paintings up of various battles that her uncle John Franklin was involved in. And the Lady Jane says, if Sophia Craycroft had a waiting room, would she hang up her failures? Jane is this wonderful, pragmatic cynic, and she knows her husband's talents, and more importantly, the talents that he doesn't have. You know, as they say, that Franklin was the man that everyone liked, but nobody respected. You know, in some ways, Jane has more in common with Crozier than with her own husband. Probably why she says she's glad that Francis is there with him. Sophia begins crying, but as yet in the episode, we don't know why. Now, the scene where Jane faces off with the Admiralty is just beautifully written. You know, you've got Jane and Sophia, these two tiny women, across the table from maybe a dozen men in naval uniforms. Jane talks about how she took off her shoes in a light snow to see how long she could bear it, and she says she made it 1.25 hours. Well, of course, the men have been out there for years now. And the head of the Admiralty responds that one's reaction to cold is relative to experience, and Jane's response is just beautiful. I think this actress had a lot of fun with it. She says that, I suspect that's the problem. Most of you have written your memoirs. I've read them. The past tense is a very sturdy thing, for it does take for granted that you have survived. Just wonderfully, wonderfully written dialogue. Small historical note before we move on. The actual real-life Lady Jane Franklin was a massive pest to the Admiralty. It's not really an exaggeration to say that there were as many searches for the Franklin expedition as there were because of her, because she just wouldn't leave them alone. Next up, we get another one of the show's wonderful juxtaposition moments where the men are enjoying a birthday party, while Goodsir is below deck, examining the photos from the day that Franklin was taken by the monster. A Marine had his head ripped off, and the puncture wounds were clearly made by 5 claws, though the front 4 were across the entire breadth of the man's chest, meaning that's how wide the claw was. Now we see Goodsir puzzling this out, obviously, you know, thinking about the size of the beast. So let's talk about Harry Goodsir for a minute. Dr. Goodsir is, at this point, as far as we know, just a kind, decent man. Like, his greatest flaw seems to be just annoying his fellows with his enthusiasm. You know, he's a surgeon by trade, and we see him plying this trade somewhat gruesomely early on in the show. But he's also an amateur naturalist. And this is actually based in the historical Goodsir, by the way. Here is a quote from Crozier to James Clark Ross in 1845. Goodsir in Erebus is a most diligent fellow, a perfect enthusiast in mollusca. He seems much in his habits like Hooker. and no, I don't know who Hooker is. Never idle, making perfect sketches of all he collects very quickly and in the most extraordinarily rough way. He has Ray's happy knack of engaging everyone around him in the same pursuit. It's kind of ironic that Lady Jane mentions Dickens in this episode, who the real-life Lady Jane did know, by the way, as good sir is, in fact, a very Dickensian way to name a character. You know, he's literally a good sir. He's a good, moral, upstanding fellow who's excited about this opportunity to see the Arctic. Next, we get Crozier below deck, the command of his own expedition at last. Now, there's some dark irony here, as he only gained a command after Franklin's death. And here he is at last, in command, getting drunk, with his two ships stuck in place, slowly getting torn apart by the ice. Now, the camera angles in this episode are all a little off-kilter, like the decks of the ship are like a mystery house. Now, this is because the ships are at the mercy of the ice. Like, they're getting lifted and dropped, you know, based on the daily shift of the ice. But it also does reflect the unease and uncertainty that they're facing. You know, in quiet moments, you can hear the ship groaning and growling as the ice presses in on them. And at last, the monster attacks the ship. So they've been in the ice for some time now, and they've turned the sails into a canopy over the deck. And when the attack comes, the creature tears through the canopy, tears the skull off one man, who is still alive, brain exposed and all, and he takes another man off and onto the ice. It never once enters Crozier's mind to not go after his man, even though, as he notes, that's the first time it's come onto the ship, and as another man notes, the creature is probably baiting them out onto the ice. We get an absolutely gorgeous bird's-eye view shot of the men going out from the ship, and then the Aurora Borealis light their way as Crozier goes off with a ship's boy, who insisted he be allowed to go. Now, this was actually the opening part of the book. The opening line, if I can remember it, was something like, Crozier comes up on deck to find his ship under attack by ghosts, referring, of course, to the Aurora. Now, Crozier sees what he thinks is his man, and he gets just a little bit ahead of the ship's boy who came with him. But the monster tricked him. As soon as they're separated, he takes the boy. Now, back on the ship, Fitzjames and Crozier are in Crozier's quarters, and Fitzjames tells him that he should probably stop his drinking, given the situation they're in. And Crozier hits him with a double-meaning line that becomes important later. He says, "We do bring our habits to terror, don't we?" Now, he drunkenly lets on that Sophia Craycroft asked Crozier to go on the voyage to keep her uncle safe. And this is surely why Sophia was crying earlier. Now, this star-crossed love in Crozier's life does have some basis in history. From one of John Franklin's letters, Crozier and I continue our friendship. He has not once mentioned Sophie's name to me, and I have not considered it proper to introduce any mention of her in my conversation. Now, this is a beautiful, painful scene between Crozier and Fitzjames, and Jared Harris absolutely lights up the screen with Crozier's pain and frustration. You know, he finds out that Fitzjames and Franklin had discussed how Sophia had rejected him, and he covers that embarrassment with booze and rage. Next, we have Cornelius Hickey listening to the Marines gripe about how this isn't what they signed up for, and you can see him listening and scheming and manipulating. So let's talk about Cornelius Hickey. Hickey is a young seaman, a caulker's mate aboard Terror. In many respects, he and Crozier are two halves of the same coin. You know, both Irish lowborn, both limited in their careers by that fact. It's very possible that in the very early going of this show, Crozier sees in young Cornelius Hickey a young Francis Crozier. In the book, Crozier is never shown as having any kind of use for him, but in episode 2 of the show, Crozier and Hickey meet in Crozier's quarters. Now, Crozier finds out that Hickey is Irish, and he asks him why he talks like an Englishman, and Hickey lies to him. You know, it's very clear to me that he trained himself to speak like an Englishman, so he wouldn't be looked down upon. And we also see that Hickey is a master manipulator. You know, he's superficially charming, and he's good at getting people to like him. He, in fact, manipulates a fellow sailor into a homosexual relationship with him. Now, in the book, this was a big dumb giant named Magnus Manson, and in the show, it's a character called Gibson. And I do like that change. You know, Hickey's all the more dangerous if he's manipulating people who aren't a little bit slow-witted. Hickey knows he's smart. And crucially, he thinks he's a lot smarter than he is. And he thinks he's a lot smarter than everyone else on the ship. Hickey is on watch, and he sees a sailor up on deck who isn't supposed to be there. It gets worse. The sailor is dead. It gets worse. It's not one guy, it's two. It's the top half of one guy and the bottom half of a totally different guy. So they get the two half bodies below deck, and the Doctor fills in Fitzjames, Crozier, Little, and Irving. They come around to the realization that neither man nor bear could or would have done this. At this moment, Crozier's mind goes back to Sophia, when he got his second rejection from her. She outright tells him that she won't marry him due to his station in life. And we get that setup line from earlier when Sophia says, "Does one not bring his habits into marriage?" This is kind of a reference to the book, and I don't know if this is coming later, so I'm hesitant to say it, but it's not that big of a spoiler. But in the book, Crozier definitely ponders on how Terror really is his wife. I like the change in Sophia's character from the book to the show. She's a bit of a dim-witted bubblehead in Simmons' book, but here she does legitimately care for Crozier, and you can see her conflictedness about it. She's not trying to be thoughtless or cruel, whereas in the book, she is exactly that. But the scene is punctuated by the Lady Jane telling Crozier, bluntly, pragmatically, as is her wont, that it's never going to happen between him and Sophia, and that this will be the greatest tragedy of his life. And she was right. Now this is Crozier being punished as a boy, experiencing that crushing first heartbreak that most of us experience in our youth. It just happened to Crozier when he was in his 40s. But then he hears a commotion up on deck, and we get this great bit where he unlocks his revolver and runs through the ship, kind of letting us see more of the ship's cramped interior. This feels like a fully realized, lived-in space, the Terror. We see it from multiple angles and different places, crowded and cramped and just real. The commotion is this. Hickey and some others have taken it upon themselves to kidnap Lady Silence, who has been camped out on the ice near them for months. Silence is there, and the men are working themselves into a frenzy, as they have some reason to believe that she has some sort of connection to the monster that's killing them. Crozier puts a quick hard stop to that and insists that the woman be made safe on Erebus. Now, we don't know yet as to why Crozier is so kind to Lady Silence. It may well be a pragmatic catch more flies with honey kind of thing. It may be that he himself is lowborn, so that he isn't going to be racist or rude to anybody based on their ethnicity or station in life, because he's so used to that. He never uses the racial slurs that the others use, like Esky. And he is really furious at Hickey's disrespect towards her. Hickey and his companions are interrogated by Crozier, Little, and Fitzjames. And this scene has a strange, painful quality to it. Like, you can really see that Hickey believes, in his heart, he has done right by the expedition, that he's done a good thing. There was an earlier scene where Hickey was talking to his former lover, Gibson, and he says, "Crozier sees something in me. He shared a drink with me." And Gibson says, "Well, you're wrong. The captain will share a drink with anyone." But I think Gibson was wrong. I think at that point, the captain really did like Hickey. Hickey describes Silence interacting with the monster, which is interesting, of course, but the real tension in this scene is between Hickey and Crozier. Hickey legitimately thought Crozier would approve of what he had done. He was wrong! You can see it the moment the energy in the room changes. Like, Hickey still thinks he has Crozier's ear, thinks he's manipulating him like he does everyone else. And he says, "I don't think that's an animal we battle out there." Crozier stops him with, "Yes, Mr. Hickey, we know." And Hickey's face just drops. Look at Fitzjames. He knows. Somebody tell Tobias Menzies he has a great, "oh, snap," face. So, here's the thing. Based on the information he had at the time, Hickey may well have made the right call. It's not outrageous to think that he made the right call based on what he knew at the time. He didn't in the context of being in the Navy, because you have to follow all orders, but we already know that he doesn't really respect authority. But what he doesn't understand, or simply refuses to acknowledge, is that when you pack 60 men into a tiny wooden box, surrounded by millions of square miles of death in every direction, you have to follow the rules. Crozier orders them whipped, per the rules back then. And Hickey won't shut up about it because, again, he thinks he's done a good thing and he doesn't respect authority. So Crozier orders him punished as a boy. Now, the whipping scene is absolutely brutal and humiliating. Difficult to watch even. It is utterly masterfully shot. The emotional content of the scene is that we see Hickey crossing the tipping point. The actor does an outstanding job of showing us the growing hatred with every lash for Crozier, as the muscles in his glutes is just literally exposed by this cat o' nine tails. We see the men who might have agreed with Hickey exchanging glances. So this is the second, more obvious meaning of the title. Hickey being punished as a boy, whipped on the butt instead of the back. Remember, I said that they're two sides of the same coin, Hickey and Crozier. And we see direct cuts between them frequently in this episode. Hickey's horrible physical pain of having been lashed mirrors Crozier's emotional agony from Sophia's rejection. Both of them tried to step above their station, and both paid for it, dearly. Afterwards, we get a brief scene with Doctors Goodsir and Stanley treating a seaman called John Morphin. We see Morphin's growing scurvy and the continued breakdown of Fitzjames as Fitzjames delivers the news of Lady Silence coming over to Erebus. Stanley pawns off feeding Silence to Dr. Goodsir, and Goodsir does so as kindly as he can, of course. He seems genuinely interested in Silence, and he's trying very hard to be nice to her. She doesn't want their pathetic rations that pass for a dinner, but Goodsir does his best. He tells her this isn't how Englishmen act, and also hilariously describes what the Northwest Passage is to her. Something tells me that Lady Silence doesn't care all that much about Sino-British trade lines, but I do have to admire the good doctor for giving it a shot. Neve Nielsen does very good work here as Lady Silence, acting really only with her face. She's very expressive, all without really expressing all that much. She's very good at projecting this sense of dangerous mystery. And the final line, just perfect. Alright everybody, that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this recap or reacted to my take on the episode, I'd love to hear from you. Get at me in the comments, get at me on Twitter. In the meantime, like, dislike, comment, hit that subscribe button. Or not, hope I gave you good reason to. Alright everybody, we'll see y'all next week for episode 5. Till then, I am the world-renowned historian. Be good, kiddos. I'm out.